Good morning. It is October 31st, 2025, and I wanted to make a video that related to one modern Wesley scholar's opinion about where John Wesley would discuss the concept of the word rapture, what we mean by rapture today. There's a writer that has taken a lot of John Wesley's writings and put them into 4 volumes in order to kind of cut away the fat and put in front of you the parts of Wesley's theology that he thinks relates most to eschatology, or the study of end times. He did this in about 2011 and other things, but this particular post or video is about that subject, this subject of eschatology, obviously. And so he calls it a John Wesley eschatological reader, and he published it about 2011. And so that's his earliest treatment, at least in the public eye, of this subject of the rapture. And his name is Mark K. Olson. So he's a professor. And so anyways, as you go into the book, he makes charts, and he tries to explain Wesley through the eyes of what he believed to be an amillennialist all his life. Towards the end of his career, he switched over to postmillennialism. And so he reads Wesley that way, and he pulls out the sermons that particularly relate to that view. And so his chart, one of his charts, has to do with like when, kind of the breakdown of the major components of Wesley's view of eschatology. And in that chart, there's something revealing about his whole understanding of it. Okay, so you can look up on your phone and you can ask AI for, get as close as you can to quote Dr. Olson on the subject of the rapture with John Wesley. And it'll basically say something similar to what he wrote in the book, that he did believers could be, quote unquote, absolved. And he says, he kind of gives the word raptured some kind of definition, but not exactly what we mean today. And he takes away the element of whether it would be pre or mid or post-trib, saying those concepts weren't developed until later into the next century. And then but he does say Wesley believed in some form of a rapture. And I think he says it strongest in the 2011 reader. And so in that statement, he said, if you go and tie that in with his chart where he says the rapture, according to John Wesley, would have taken place, in my view, he doesn't put it in the right place, okay? But he explains that John Wesley, in his view, would put it between the 2 millenniums, okay? But then, as his discussion of the subject has developed over the years, till he has some discourses online and things that where he brings out the major components of John Wesley's eschatology in different contexts, he seems to suggest, at least according to AI's understanding of it, that somehow it's associated with the second coming in some way like that. And but that would be inconsistent with the chart. Okay, so that's what I want to point out to you first of all, is that it's very clear that Wesley makes statements when he brings up the concept of the rapture that would associate it with the second coming of Christ. Okay, but what does he mean by that? When does he mean? These questions are important. Okay. But what I like is that Dr. Olson has at least admitted that Wesley had some view that we would kind of understand to be close to what we mean today by the rapture, even though he would take away the time element of it. But he would, like I said already, he associates it later on with the second coming. But in the chart, he puts it between the 2 millenniums. Okay. Now, if you want a summation of a lot of the things I've been pointing out over the years on the subject, I probably have found minimally, probably about 20 or 30 contexts where John Wesley's talking about the rapture. Okay. And one thing that is also brought up in the discussion about Olson's view is that he says that the word rapture was not typical of that day. So he's kind of pointing out that Wesley used a different word here or there. But I do want you to see that Adam Clark, contemporary with Wesley, used the exact word. Okay, so we can look this up. On one of my posts on Facebook from November 3rd of 2018, I wrote this. I said, amazing, though the premier Wesleyan commentator and contemporary of John Wesley started off his commentary notes stating and then restating, and I point this out because Adam Clark admitted, as did Wesley, that much more than Wesley, I would think, that his understanding of Revelation was limited. Okay, he says, I do not understand it, meaning the book of Revelation. But then listen how in chapter 4, verse 1, which in Revelation we're talking about, and verse 2, he notes about a literal rapture of John, which appears in the text, and he, quote, prior to the entire 7-year tribulation period. So that's my interpretation of Revelation there, okay? And Dr. Ralph Earl's as well. I learned it from Dr. Ralph Earl. Dr. Ralph Earl loved Adam Clark, and he abridged his commentary, okay? So there's a modern abridgment of Adam Clark's multi-volume commentary, and Ralph Earl's in charge of that. So Ralph Earl saw some connections, all right? But listen to this. Here he's quoting Adam Clark directly. Number 1, in Revelation chapter 4, this is Adam Clark's notes on it, a door was opened in heaven. This appears to have been a visible aperture in the sky over his head. This is exactly what modern pre-tribulation rapturists think, okay, about the passage. And then the second point he says is, I was in the Spirit, and then listen to the exact word, wrapped, R-A-P-T, up in an ecstasy, okay? And so that's commentary bridged by Dr. Ralph Earl. It's page 1338 in that book, which I read through, okay? But, so it's not like the word didn't exist. So I put on the end there an explanation of that. This word wrapped, R-A-P-T, was the Old English form of the word rapture. And Adam Clark is saying John the Apostle was literally raptured into heaven here through a door open in the sky. All right, so it's not like the word was totally foreign to John Wesley. Okay, they also try to do this with terms like eradication. John Fletcher used the term eradication in his volumes at least 3 times. You know, talking about the sin nature, eradicated. They act like that was a later development, much later development in the like Church of the Nazarenes doctrine, or in their formative years or something like that. And it's not true. These words were there and they understood them. Okay, so let's keep going. Let me give you a context where John Wesley used the concept of the rapture. All right. So here's some of the different points I've made over the years. All right. Besides that one, so probably one of my beginning points I like to point out is scholarship today is definitely not settled, and they weren't settled in the past, on what view John Wesley held on eschatology. Okay, so you know whether he is, the main 2 contentions were premillennialist or postmillennialist. There's nobody till I'm aware of, till Mark K. Olson, that thought he was an amillennialist, okay, at all. And it's very interesting, and I'll point that out later, that one of the people who have worked with Olson on different things denies that whole concept from the basic Wesleyan construct of church history. You know, John Wesley believed, contrary to amillennialists, that the classic amillennialist understanding that when Emperor Constantine came to power, hell itself, darkened the whole entire church and corrupted it. So he was not in the view of amillennialism. I mean, that's the most clear understanding, and one of Olson's type scholars has pointed that out, that it's not, even though he believes that John Wesley was falsely that John Wesley was a post-millennialist, modern scholar today, but he did see that that's an impossibility with John Wesley. Okay, so we can settle that right there. Okay, but here, the only place you can even try to pretend that John Wesley believed in a double millennium, and he seemed to have accepted it, and most people who are being more honest with the facts will say, at least for a short while. Okay, so he definitely didn't continue to believe it. If he did believe it at the time, 1754, 1755, when he wrote the New Testament notes, which is mid-career, by the way, not the mature John Wesley. Okay, these are points I've made over the years multiple times. Okay, if he did believe it, he sure does. Even in the New Testament commentary, he doesn't seem to say this, and he clearly, years later, when he was accused of stating the end of the world, which in the post-millennial reading of Wesley would be accurate, he denies that he ever said it was the end of the world. Instead, he says it's the beginning of the millennium, which he clearly separates from himself. Even he doesn't say, I absolutely own the state. I was giving you a suggestion from my mentor, my sudden mentor, starting about 1750s, on end times, which is Bengel. He was most people today just know him as a father of like textual criticism in some sense. But they don't realize that, earlier writers such as the Presbyterian minister Nathaniel West, who was a very studious person on the subject of John Wesley, believed that John Wesley was a premillennialist, as do I. Wrote on him first, set the first American push for the view that John Wesley was a premillennialist. And so you need to read that writing. It's still suggested by scholars like Dr. Ken Collins. He thinks you should read it to get a layout of it, and it has all kinds of information. It's very important. But Nathaniel West is, he was contradicted by modern scholar Randy Maddox, who does not believe John Wesley was a premillennialist, obviously. But Maddox took him to task, just saying that he didn't defend the point. He just barely stated that he never accepted the two millenniums. And that's an important point. It's very hard, even when you read the commentary notes on Revelation from John Wesley, to absolutely push that he wasn't just stating this as Bengel's idea. He sounds positive about the thought, but you can't, you can't align it with other points that John Wesley made over his career. So here we are, even 10 years later, in his Old Testament notes, Wesley tells you the statement that in Isaiah, that he's also famous for, the only one that most scholars are familiar with, where he states in his commentary that these things won't happen until Christ comes to reign on the earth. So there he is 10 years after his New Testament notes, and he's telling you there's one millennium. He never says there's two outside of the New Testament notes. You can't find it anywhere where he agrees with that. And that's been pointed out by old school scholars a long time ago. Okay, and so if he gave any credence to it at all, the only place you can find it is mid-career in his New Testament notes, which, by the way, there were people who surrounded Bengel and were contemporaries with him, and they did not believe that Bengel owned up to his two millennium concept. So this is a very difficult subject, and a lot of people try to do easy clean sweeps with John Wesley and just try to put him in one category or other with all kinds of ease, and it's just not the case. You can't do that. It's a much harder subject than people are letting on to. All right, but so here's another thing. Here's John Wesley. Now notice he's talking about an antediluvian. He's talking about the person Enoch. Enoch, is very shortly after Adam. Okay, and he's before the flood. and he's taken up in a rapture-like position. And today, pre-tribbers use him as an example of the rapture. Okay, and John Wesley does the same thing in his Old Testament notes, written 10 years after his New Testament notes. Okay, so let's look at that. John Wesley defending the pre-trib, premillennial rapture, 10 years after supposedly becoming a post-millennialist, which I think never happened. Speaking of the translation or rapture of Enoch in comparison with raptured saints. So he's going to compare it. Now, guys, you got to think about that. Put John Wesley back in the historical context of 1765. This would be the best way to deal with this. And look at what Wesley usually was on themes. And I've done a study on this. For about 4 of the 5 first books, Wesley has his entire focus on end times. He keeps making associations between things in the early chapters of Genesis all the way through the book of Numbers with the second coming. So obviously something had him on that theme. As you go on into the Old Testament notes, as some have pointed out, he starts to focus on other things where he sounds more like he's associating a lot of the passages that would have to do with end times, more with like the time frame of the first coming. Some people think he sounded like a preterist. I was reading some posts online on Facebook yesterday night, and some person was trying to say John Wesley was a preterist, as in everything was already fulfilled and there's no end times in John Wesley's view. And some student came underneath that post after the guy did his best to show that with quotes from Wesley, and the other person responded and said he's not a full preterist. He definitely believed in future that was still to come. Well, guys, that's very clear. Okay, so it's true. So Mark Olson's view on this is that chapters 1 of Revelation through chapter about I think he says 16 is all historicist view. So it's kind of put in the past, and he's associating it with historical past times. Well, that was kind of the framework of his day. Okay, guys, again, let's not, a lot of people say, Ben, don't, if you look at my post, you'll see me saying John Wesley and John Fletcher were pre-trib, premillennialist. Well, I do believe that's true. Okay, but they would say don't be anachronistic, don't put him into some package from the future. Well, then don't do that on your side of things. Okay, there was no view until just recent, very, very recent, where we would distinguish between categories of premillennialists. Either you were a postmillennialist in the 1800s and before that, or you were a premillennialist or an amillennialist. There was no such thing as a historical premillennialist. Okay, and you can hear Olson kind of using modern terminology when he's eschewing the same idea about the rapture, but he's associating Wesley with the first 16 chapters are historicist view. I don't think so. Back then, that was the way pre-millennialists wrote, and that's what they understood. It doesn't mean that you can isolate him from futurist reading. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this example of the rapture discussion by Wesley himself. Quote, he was not, for God took him. This is Enoch. That is, as it is explained in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5. So now he's directly relating it to the New Testament place where it used the word translate. He's going to use that. He was translated that he should not see death. That's what we mean by the rapture today. It's exactly what we mean. All right. The translation of living saints, without death. So let's keep going. And was not found, because God had translated him. But why did God take him so soon? Okay. Surely because the world, which was now grown corrupt, was not worthy of him. Okay. So notice that Wesley here is making a analogy between the old Genesis account pre-flood, like Jesus did, and the second coming. Okay. Which I think specifically he's talking about the rapture here. Okay. Because his work was done, so this is Enoch, and done the sooner for his minding it so closely. That means he was just focused on what he was supposed to be and do. He was not, that means, taken, for God took him. He was not any longer in this world. It was not the period of his being, but of his being here. He was not found. So the apostle explains it from the 70 in the Septuagint. He's even gone over and checked out the Septuagint on this verse. Not found by his friends who sought him, as the sons of the prophets sought Elijah in 2 Kings 2:17. So he's associating, just like modern day pre-tribbers do, with both Enoch and Elijah. We think were raptured in their own way. Okay, God took him body and soul. Hear this. That's a clear explanation of John Wesley to say exactly what we mean today by the rapture, to himself in the heavenly paradise. That's where he brought him. Okay, by the ministry of angels, as afterwards he took Elijah. He was changed as those saints shall be, that would be found alive at Christ's second coming. Now this is a place where he tells us when, a hint of when the rapture will take place. Some would say this is the entire second coming. Well, you can't work that out in his book of Revelation. If you want to have a whole Wesley that even somehow, which most scholars today do, want to include the New Testament notes and what his view was at that time, without dismissing it entirely, then you're gonna have to read Revelation in there, and the whole book. And I've done this many times. I've worked through his difficult passages there, and I don't believe he's saying at this second coming exactly. I think what he's saying is at the first part of the second coming, which would to him be a pre-trib view. Okay, which we'll talk about as we keep going. Okay, so clearly Wesley has told us that this is a parallel, and he's saying the world's getting so corrupt, and there's just this limited one individual who is raptured out in the old school, and he's paralleling that to the New Testament times. Okay, Wesley's obviously got a futurist statement here in the New Testament notes, 10 years more developed in his theology. Okay, where he's telling us people are going to be raptured at the time of the second coming. Which I don't think he means exactly at the second coming. I think he means with the associated time frame, okay, of the second coming, which is what pre-tribbers mean today. Okay, so let's go on with another proof that we've posted over the years. These are helpful to people looking for this subject. All right, so today one of the modern scholars has noticed some of my notes on my view of John Fletcher. Okay, and John Fletcher came into play because after 1770, Wesley, I believe, made John Fletcher and his theology one. And that's why he cared so much to make fine-tuning and all the corrections that people today see as Wesley going against Fletcher, which wasn't the case. They're building on each other's theology, and they made it one, and they even argued as though they were one as the time went on, from 1770 on. And so Wesley made him his designated successor, and there's modern scholars who are with me on this view. Maybe some of you have not followed my posts online with that. I will talk to you about those as well. But let's stay on subject here. First of all, let's just show you that John Fletcher and John Wesley both believe this way. I put this up 3 years ago, and this is the key, okay? So, I put this in December 22nd of 2022. This is too great of news to hold out on, everybody. I can prove that John Wesley and John Fletcher were pre-trib, premillennialist, rapturists in their final and most mature theologies, which would be from 1775 to 91 in Wesley's life, because Fletcher died before that. But their influence came together on this. And this is Fletcher writing. Now, the modern neo take on this passage is that they go with a date that isn't in the works of Fletcher. It's from Luke Tyerman, okay? And it's interesting because they sure tend to ignore when Luke Tyerman makes dates that conform with more conservative views on things like this. But all of a sudden, he's right that this was an earlier letter written when John Fletcher was just really saved, where he's trying to bring, around the time of the New Testament notes, Wesley back towards a premillennial view. Okay, that's not what happened. This is much later. Okay, so let's look at what I have. Fletcher gives the shortest summation of his favorite end times writer, which is his uncle on his mother's side, and he gives him Fletcher was a premillennialist his entire life, and I believe a pre-trib premillennialist. Okay, I've read through his entire works and his biography, and you could see in both things very clearly that this is where he stood. And most history has agreed with that. Okay, but today there are scholars that are, one scholar that I'm aware of that has tried to tell me no, he followed Wesley and became a post-millennialist. And I have answers to that subject as well. But let's keep going. Fletcher gives the shortest summation of his favorite end times writer to Wesley in 1775. That's the date in the actual works of Fletcher. Everybody's trying to ignore. The date with this is that this was given to Wesley much later in the key years after 1770, when they were forming their most mature view. And so I believe Wesley came over 100% to John Fletcher's view, and that he's sharing with us from his uncle on his mother's side, and it's pre-trib. All right. And then John Wesley promoted his work as his own theology as the Wesley/Fletcher scholar Lawrence Wood. Lawrence Wood is on the right side of this subject, where he's proven that Fletcher and Wesley's theology came together very strongly, so much so that he can argue that Wesley's view about the baptism of the Holy Spirit against modern scholarship is the same as John Fletcher's. Okay, and he comes over to that view. Well, then he tries to argue, contrary to his own reasoning, that Fletcher was a post-millennialist, and that and that Wesley shared that view with him, and that's just not the case. Okay, they, if you could say the one argument for the baptism of the Holy Spirit, you have to agree with what Fletcher did here, and that Wesley came over to his pre-trib, pre-millennial view fully. And Wesley was, I believe, always leaning that way. I believe he always was that way. Modern scholarship today leans that Charles Wesley, most of his life, if not all of his life, was a pre-millennialist. Okay, they're very clear on that one. Some have tried to say, like we'll talk about later, that later on in his career, which we have no evidence of because his journals and diaries end early, but they tried to say he started to sway a little bit away from that. Charles Wesley did, but it's not true. Charles was lifelong premillennialist. By the way, so was Samuel, their father, which we have proof of, and I put on Facebook. So as John Wesley, as we're seeing here. Okay, so let's keep going. After describing how the Pope historically has fulfilled the historical line of the Antichrist, starting in 550 or 530 BC, Fletcher then adds Daniel's 2300 prophetic days or years to it, equaling the beginning of the figurative fall of Roman Catholicism via the Pope to the Wesley revival between 1750 and 1770, when Fletcher's and Wesley's theology became one. So he's basically saying that, all this stuff that has been a constant problem against Christianity through Roman Catholicism comes to an end as we get into the major push of the Wesley revival. And so, yes, the Wesley revival at the end plays a part in the end times view